Chapter 9. I moved to block his hand, but it halted in mid-reach. Turning my head, I saw that another hand had fallen upon Gerard's arm, was now grasping it, was holding it back. I rolled away. When I looked up again, I saw that Ganelon had caught hold of him. Gerard jerked his arm forward, but it did not come free. "Stay out of this, Ganelon," he said.
"Get going, Corwin," Ganelon said. "Get the jewel."
Even as he called out, Gerard was beginning to rise. Ganelon crossed with his left and connected with Gerard's jaw. Gerard sprawled at his feet. Ganelon moved in and swung a kick toward his kidney, but Gerard caught his foot and heaved him over backward. I scrambled back into a crouch, supporting myself with one hand. Gerard came up off the ground and rushed Ganelon, who was just recovering his feet. As he was almost upon him, Ganelon came up with a double-fisted blow to Gerard's midsection, which halted him in his tracks. Instantly, Ganelon's fists were moving like pistons against Gerard's abdomen. For several moments, Gerard seemed too dazed to protect himself, and when he finally bent and brought his arms in, Ganelon caught him with a right to the jaw that staggered him backward. Ganelon immediately rushed forward, throwing his arms about Gerard as he slammed into him and hooking his right leg behind Gerard's own. Gerard toppled and Ganelon fell upon him. He straddled Gerard then and drove his right fist against his jaw. When Gerard's head rolled back, Ganelon crossed with his left. Benedict suddenly moved to intervene, but Ganelon chose that moment to rise to his feet. Gerard lay unconscious, bleeding from his mouth and nose. I got shakily to my own feet, dusted myself off. Ganelon grinned at me.
"Don't stay around," he said. "I don't know how I'd do in a rematch. Go find the trinket."
I glanced at Benedict, and he nodded. I returned to the tent for Grayswandir. When I emerged, Gerard still had not moved, but Benedict stood before me.
"Remember," he said, "you've my trump and I've yours. Nothing final without a conference."
I nodded. I was going to ask him why he seemed willing to help Gerard, but not me, but second thoughts had me and I decided against spoiling our fresh-minted amity. "Okay." I headed toward the horses. Ganelon clapped me on the shoulder as I came up to him.
"Good luck," he said. "I'd go with you, but I'm needed here. Especially with Benedict trumping off to chaos."
"Good show," I said. "I shouldn't have any trouble, so don't worry." I went off to the paddock. Shortly, I was mounted and moving. Ganelon threw me a salute as I passed, and I returned it. Benedict was kneeling beside Gerard. I headed for the nearest trail into Arden. The sea lay at my back, Garnath and the Black Road to the left, and Colvir to my right. I had to gain some distance before I could work with the stuff of shadow. The day lay clear once Garnath was lost to sight, several rises and dips later. I struck the trail and followed its long curve into the wood, where moist shadows and distant bird songs reminded me of the long periods of peace we had known of old, and the silken gleaming presence of the maternal unicorn. My aches faded into the rhythm of the ride, and I thought once again of the encounter I had departed. It was not difficult to understand Gerard's attitude, since he had already told me of his suspicions and issued me a warning. Still, it was such bad timing for whatever had happened with Brand that I could not but see it as another action intended either to slow me or to stop me entirely. It was fortunate that Ganelon had been on hand, in good shape, and able to put his fists in the right places at the proper times. I wondered what Benedict would have done if there had only been the three of us present. I had a feeling he would have waited and intervened only at the very last moment to stop Gerard from killing me. I was still not happy with our accord, though it was certainly an improvement over the previous state of affairs. All of which made me wonder again what had become of Brand. Had Fiona or Blaze finally gotten to him? Had he attempted his proposed assassinations single-handed and been met with a counter-thrust, then dragged through his intended victim's trump? Had his old allies from the courts of chaos somehow gotten through to him? Had one of his horny-handed guardians from the tower finally been able to reach him? Or had it been as I had suggested to Gerard, an accidental self-injury in a fit of rage, followed by an ill-tempered flight from Amber to do his brooding and plotting elsewhere? When that many questions arise from a single event, the answer is seldom obtainable by pure logic. I had to sort out the possibilities, though, to have something to reach for when more facts did turn up. In the meantime, I thought carefully over everything he had told me regarding his allegations in light of those things which I now knew. With one exception, I did not doubt most of the facts. He had built too cleverly to have the edifice simply toppled. But then, he had had a lot of time to think these things over. No, it was in his manner of presenting events that something had been hidden by misdirection. Sorry, my fan keeps blowing my pages closed while I'm trying to read and stuff. His recent proposal practically assured me of that. The old trail twisted, widened, narrowed again, swung to the northwest and downward into the thickening wood. The forest had changed very little. It seemed almost the same trail a young man had ridden centuries before, riding for the sheer pleasure of it, riding to explore that vast green realm which extended over most of the continent, if he did not stray into shadow. It would be good to be doing it again for no other reason than this. After perhaps an hour, I had worked my way well back into the forest, where the trees were great dark towers. What sunlight I glimpsed caught like phoenix nests in the highest branches, an always moist twilight softness, smoothing the outlines of stumps and boles, logs and mossy rocks. A deer bounded across my path, not trusting to the excellent concealment of a thicket at the right of the trail. Bird notes sounded about me, never too near. Occasionally I crossed the tracks of other horsemen. Some of these were quite fresh, but they did not stay long with the trail. Colvire was well out of sight, had been for some time. The trail rose again, and I knew that I would shortly reach the top of a small ridge, pass among rocks, and head downward once more. The trees thinned somewhat as we climbed, until finally I was afforded a partial view of the sky. It was enlarged as I continued, and when I came to the summit I heard the distant cry of a hunting bird. Glancing upward, I saw a great dark shape, circling and circling, high above me. I hurried past the boulders and shook the reins for a burst of speed as soon as the way was clear. We plunged downward, racing to get under the cover of the larger trees once again. The bird cried out as we did this, but we won to the shade, to the dimness, without incident. I slowed gradually after that and continued to listen, but there were no untoward sounds on the air. This part of the forest was pretty much the same as that we had left beyond the ridge, save for a small stream we picked up and paralleled for a time, finally crossing it at a shallow ford. Beyond, the trail widened, and a little more light leaked through and flowed with us for half a league. We had almost come a sufficient distance for me to begin those small manipulations of shadow which would bear me to the pathway back to the shadow earth of my former exile. Yet it would be difficult to begin here, easier farther along. I resolved to save the strain on myself and my mount by continuing to a better beginning. Nothing of a threatening nature had really occurred. The bird could be a wild hunter, and probably was. Only one thought nagged at me as I rode. Julian. Arden was Julian's preserve, patrolled by his rangers. I lost my spot. Sheltering several encampments of his troops at all times. Amber's inland border guard, both against incursions natural and against those which might appear at the boundaries of shadow. Where did Julian go when he had departed the palace so suddenly on the night of Bran's stabbing? If he wished simply to hide, there was no necessity for him to flee farther than this. Here he was strong, backed by his own men, moving in a realm he knew far better than the rest of us. It was quite possible that he was not, right now, too far away. Also, he liked to hunt. He had his hellhounds, he had his birds. A half mile, a mile. Just then, I heard the sound that I feared most. Piercing the green in the shade, there came the notes of a hunting horn. They came from some distance behind me, and I think from the left of the trail. I urged my mount to a gallop, and the trees rushed to a blur on either side. The trail was straight and level here, and we took advantage of this. Then, from behind, I heard a roar, a kind of deep-chested coughing, growling sound backed by a lot of resonant lung space. I did not know what it was that had uttered it, but it was no dog. Not even a hellhound sounded like that. I glanced back, but there was no pursuit in sight, so I kept low and talked to Drum a bit. After a time, I heard a crashing noise in the woods off to my right, but the roar was not repeated just then. I looked again several times, but I was unable to make out what it was that was causing the disturbance. Shortly thereafter, I heard the horn once more, much nearer, and this time it was answered by the barks and the baying which I could not mistake. The hellhounds were coming. Swift, powerful, vicious beasts that Julian had found in some shadow and trained to the hunt. It was time, I decided, to begin the shift. Amber was still strong about me, but I laid hold of Shadow as best as I could and started the movement. The trail began to curve to the left, and as we raced along it, the trees at either hand diminished in size and fell back. Another curve and the trail led us through a clearing, perhaps 200 meters across. I glanced up then and saw that damned bird was still circling, much nearer now, close enough to be dragged with me through Shadow. And this was more complicated than I had intended. I wanted an open space in which to wheel my mount and swing a blade freely if it came to that. The occurrence of such a place, however, revealed my position quite nicely to the bird, whom it was proving difficult to lose. All right. I came to a low hill, mounted it, and started downward, passing a lone, lightning-blasted tree as we did. On its nearest branch sat a hawk of gray and silver and black. I whistled to it as we passed, and it leaped into the air, shrieking a savage battle cry. Hurrying on, I heard the individual voices of the dogs clearly now, and the thud of the horses' hoofs. Mixed in with these sounds there was something else, more vibration, a shuddering of the ground. I looked back again, but none of my pursuit had yet topped the hill. I bent my mind toward the way away, and clouds occluded the sun. Strange flowers appeared along the trail, green and yellow and purple, and there came a rumble of distant thunders. The clearing widened, lengthened. It became completely level. I heard once again the sound of the horn. I turned for another look. It bounded into view then, and I realized at that instant that I was not the object of the hunt. That the riders, the dogs, the bird, were pursuing the thing that ran behind me. Of course, this was a rather academic distinction in that I was in front, and quite possibly the object of its hunt. I leaned forward, shouting to Drum and digging in with my knees, realizing even as I did that the abomination was moving faster than we could. It was a panic reaction. I was being pursued by a manticora. The last time I had seen its like was on the day before the battle in which Eric had died. As I had led my troops up the rearward slopes of Colvier, it had appeared to tear a man named Rawl in half. We had dispatched it with automatic weapons. The thing proved 12 feet in length, and like this one, it had worn a human face on the head and the shoulders of a lion. It, too, had a pair of eagle-like wings folded against its sides and the long, pointed tail of a scorpion curving into the air above it. A number of them had somehow wandered in from Shadow to devil our steps as we headed for that battle. There was no reason to believe that all of them had been accounted for, save that none had been reported since the time, and no evidence of their continued existence in the vicinity of Amber had come to light. Apparently, this one had wandered down into Arden and been living in the forest since that time. A final glance showed me that I might be pulled down in moments if I did not make a stand. It also showed me a dark avalanche of dogs rushing down the hill. I did not know the intelligence or psychology of the manticora. Most fleeing beasts will not stop to attack something which is not bothering them. Self-preservation is generally foremost in their minds. On the other hand, I was not certain that the Manticora even realized that it was being pursued. It might have started out on my trail and only had its own picked up afterward. It might have only the one thing on its mind. It was hardly a time to pause and reflect on all the possibilities. I drew a gray swan deer and turned my mount to the left, pulling back on the reins immediately as he made the turn. Drum screamed and rose high onto its hind legs. I felt myself sliding backward, and so I jumped to the ground and leaped to the side. But I had, for the moment, forgotten the speed of the stormhounds, had also forgotten how easily they had once overtaken Random and myself in Flora's Mercedes. Had also forgotten that, unlike ordinary dogs chasing cars, they had begun tearing the vehicle apart. Suddenly, they were all over the Manticora. A dozen or more dogs, leaping and biting. The beast threw back its head and uttered another cry as they struck at it. It kept swinging that vicious tail through them, sending one flying, stunning or killing two others. It reared then and turned, striking out with its forelegs as it descended. But even as it did this, a hound attached itself to its left foreleg. Two more were at its haunches, and one had scrambled onto its back, biting at its shoulder and neck. The others were circling it now. As soon as it would go after one, the others would dart in and slash at it. It finally got the one on its back with its scorpion sting, and disemboweled the one gnawing at its leg. However, it was running blood from a double dozen wounds by then. Shortly, it became apparent that the leg was giving it trouble, both for striking purposes and for bearing its weight when it struck with the others. In the meantime, another dog had mounted its back and was tearing at its neck. It seemed to be having a more difficult time getting at this one. Another came in from its right and shredded its ear. Two more plied its haunches, and when it reared again, one rushed in and tore at its belly. Their barks and growls also seemed to be confusing it somewhat, and it began striking wildly at the ever-moving gray shapes. I had caught hold of Drum's bridle and was trying to calm him sufficiently to remount and get the hell out of there. He kept trying to rear and pull away, and it took considerable persuasion even to hold him in place. In the meantime, the Manticora let out a bitter, wailing cry. It had struck wildly at the dog on its back and driven its sting into its own shoulder. The dogs took advantage of this distraction and rushed in wherever there was an opening, snapping and tearing. I'm certain the dogs would have finished it, but at that moment the riders topped the hill and descended. There were 5 of them, Julian in the lead. He had on his scaled white armor, and his hunting hoard hung about his neck. He rode his gigantic steed Morgenstern, a beast which had always hated me. He raised the long lance that he bore and saluted with it in my direction. Then he lowered it and shouted orders to the dogs. Grudgingly, they dropped away from the prey. Even the dog on the Manticora's back loosened its grip and leaped to the ground. All of them drew back as Julian couched the lance and touched his spurs to Morgenstern's sides. The beast turned toward him, gave a final cry of defiance, and leaped ahead, fangs bared. They came together, and for a moment my view was blocked by Morgenstern's shoulder. Another moment, however, and I knew from the horse's behavior that the blow had been a true one. A turning, and I saw the beast stretched out, great gouts of blood upon its breast, flowering about the dark stem of the lance. Julian dismounted. He said something to the other riders which I did not overhear. They remained mounted. He regarded the still twitching Manticora, then looked at me and smiled. He crossed and placed his foot upon the breast, seized the lance with one hand and wrenched it from the carcass. Then he drove it into the ground and tethered Morgenstern to its shaft. He reached up and patted the horse's shoulder, looked back at me, turned, and headed in my direction. When he came up before me, he said,
"I wish you hadn't killed Bella."
"Bella?" I repeated. He glanced at the sky, and I followed his gaze. Neither bird was now in sight.
"He was one of my favorites."
"I'm sorry," I said. I misunderstood what was going on. He nodded.
All right, I've done something for you, and now you can tell me what's happened after I left the palace. Did Brand make it?
Yes, I said, and you're off the hook on that. He claimed Fiona stabbed him. And she was not around to question either. She departed during the night, also. It's a wonder you didn't bump into each other. He smiled.
I'd have guessed as much, he said.
Why did you flee under such suspicious circumstances? I asked. It made it look bad for you. He shrugged.
It would not be the first time I've been falsely accused or suspected. And for that matter, if intent counts for anything, I'm as guilty as our little sister. I'd have done it myself if I could. In fact, I'd a blade ready the night we fetched him back, only I was crowded aside.
But why? I asked. He laughed.
Why? I'm afraid of the bastard, that's why. For a long while I thought he was dead, and certainly hoped so, finally claimed by the dark powers he dealt with. How much do you really know about him, Corwin?
We had a long talk.
And?
He admitted that he and Blaze and Fiona had formed a plan to claim the throne. They would see Blaze crowned, but each would share the real power. They had used the forces you referred to assure Dad's absence. Brand said that he had attempted to win Cain to their cause, but that Cain had instead gone to you and to Eric. The three of you then formed a similar cabal to seize power before they could, by placing Eric on the throne. He nodded.
The events are in order, but the reason is not. We did not want the throne, at least not that abruptly, nor at that time. We formed our group to oppose their group because it had to be opposed to protect the throne. At first, the most we could persuade Eric to do was to assume a protectorship. He was afraid he would quickly turn up dead if he saw himself crowned under those conditions. Then you turned up with your very legitimate claim. We could not afford to let you press it at that time because Brand's crowd was threatening out-and-out war. We felt that they would be less inclined to make this move if the throne was already occupied. We could not have seated you because you would have refused to be a puppet, a role you would have had to play since the game was already in progress and you were ignorant on too many fronts. And so we persuaded Eric to take the risk and be crowned, and that was how it had happened.
So when I did arrive, you put out my eyes and threw me in the dungeon for laughs. Julian turned away and looked back at the dead Manticora.
You are a fool,
he finally said.
You were a tool from the very beginning. They used you to force our hand, and either way you lost. If that half-assed attack of Blaze had somehow succeeded, you wouldn't have lasted long enough to draw a deep breath. If it failed, as it did, Blaze disappeared, as he did, leaving you with your life forfeit for attempted usurpation. You had served your purpose and you had to die. They left us small choice in the matter. By rights, we should have killed you, and you know it.
I bit my lip. There were many things I might say. But if he was telling something approximating the truth, he did have a point. And I did want to hear more.
Eric, he said, figured that your eyesight might eventually be restored, knowing the way we regenerate, given time. It was a very delicate situation. If Dad were to return, Eric could step down and justify all of his actions to anyone's satisfaction, except for killing you. That would have been too patent a move to ensure his continued reign beyond the troubles of the moment. And I will tell you frankly that he simply wanted to imprison you and forget you.
Then whose idea was the blinding? He sat silent again for a long while, and then he spoke very softly, almost a whisper.
Hear me out, please. It was mine, and it may have saved your life. Any action taken against you had to be tantamount to death, or their faction would have tried for the real thing. You were no longer of any use to them, but alive and about, you possessed the potentiality of becoming a danger at some future time. They could have used your trump to contact you and kill you, or they could have used it to free you in order to sacrifice you in yet another move against Eric. Blinded, however, there was no need to slay you. and you're of no use for anything else they might have in mind. It saved you by taking you out of the picture for a time, and it saved us from a more egregious act which might one day be held against us. As we saw it, there was no choice. It was the only thing we could do. There could be no show of leniency either, or we might be suspected of having some use for you ourselves. The moment you assumed any such semblance of value, you would have been a dead man. The most we could do was look the other way whenever Lord Rhine contrived to comfort you. That was all that could be done.
I see, I said.
Yes, he agreed. You saw too soon. No one had guessed you would recover your sight that quickly, nor that you'd be able to escape once you did. How did you manage it?
Does Maisie still gimbals? I said.
Beg pardon?
I said, never mind. What do you know of Bran's imprisonment, then? He regarded me once more.
All that I know is that there was some sort of falling out within his group. I lack the particulars. For whatever reason, Blaze and Fiona were afraid to kill him and afraid to let him run loose. When we freed him from their imprisonment, Fiona was apparently more afraid of having him free.
And you said you feared him enough to have made ready to kill him. Why now, after all this time, when all of this is history and the power has shifted again? He was weak, virtually helpless. What harm could he do now? He sighed.
I do not understand the power that he possesses, he said, but it is considerable. I know that he can travel through shadow with his mind, that he can sit in a chair, locate what he seeks in shadow, and then bring it to him by an act of will without moving from the chair. And he can travel through shadow physically in a somewhat similar fashion. He lays his mind upon the place he would visit, forms a kind of mental doorway, and simply steps through. For that matter, I believe he can sometimes tell what people are thinking. It is almost as if he has himself become sort of a living trump. I know these things because I have seen him do them. Near the end, when we had him under surveillance in the palace, he had eluded us once in this fashion. This was the time he traveled to the Shadow Earth and had you placed in Bedlam. After his recapture, one of us remained with him at all times. We did not yet know that he could summon things through shadow, however. When he became aware that you had escaped your confinement, he summoned a horrid beast which had attacked Cain, who was then his bodyguard. Then he went to you once again. Blaze and Fiona apparently got hold of him shortly after that, before we could, and did not see him again until that night in the library when we brought him back. I fear him because he has deadly powers which I do not understand.
In such a case, I wonder how they managed to confine him at all.
Fiona has similar strengths, and I believe Blaze did also. Between the two of them, they could apparently annul most of Bran's power while they created a place where it would be inoperative.
Not totally, I said. He got a message to random. In fact, he reached me once, weakly.
Obviously not totally, then, he said. Sufficiently, however, until we broke through the defenses.
What do you know of all their byplay with me, confining me, trying to kill me, saving me?
That I do not understand, he said, except that it was part of the power struggle within their own group. They had had a falling out amongst themselves, and one side or the other had some use for you. So, naturally, one side was trying to kill you while the other fought to preserve you. Ultimately, of course, Blaze got the most mileage out of you in that attack he launched.
But he was the one who tried to kill me back in the Shadow Earth, I said. He was the one who shot out my tires.
Oh?
Well, that is what Brand told me. But it jives with all sorts of secondary evidence. He shrugged.
I cannot help you with that, he said. I simply do not know what was going on among them at that time.
Yet you countenance Fiona and Amber, I said. In fact, You are more than a little cordial to her whenever she is about.
Of course, he said, smiling. I've always been very fond of Fiona. She is certainly the loveliest, most civilized of us all.
Pity Dad was always so against brother-sister marriages.
As you well know. It bothered me that we had to be adversaries for so long as we were. Things returned pretty much to normal after Blaze's death, your imprisonment, and Eric's coronation. She accepted their defeat gracefully, and that was that. She was obviously as frightened at the prospect of Bran's return as I was.
Brand told things differently, I said. But then, of course, he would. For one thing, he claims that Blaze is still living, that he hunted him down with his trump and knows that he is off in shadow, training another force for another strike at Amber.
I suppose this is possible, Julian said, but we are more than adequately prepared, are we not?
He claims further that the strike will be a feint, I continued, and that the real attack will come direct from the courts of chaos, over the Black Road. He says that Fiona is off preparing the way for this right now. He scowled.
I hope he was simply lying, he said. I would hate to see their group resurrected and at us once again. This time with help from the dark direction. And I would hate to see Fiona involved.
Brand claimed he was out of it himself, and that he had seen the error of his ways, and such like penitent noises.
Ha! I'd sooner trust that beast I just slew than take Brand at his word. I hope you've got the good sense to keep him well guarded, though this might not be of much avail if he has his old powers back.
But what game could he be playing now?
Either he has revived the old triumvirate, a thought I like not at all, or he has a new plan all his own. But mark me, he has a plan. He has never been satisfied to be a mere spectator of anything. He is always scheming. I'd take an oath he even plots in his sleep.
Perhaps you're right, I said. You see, there has been a new development, whether for good or ill, I cannot yet tell. I just had a fight with Gerard. He thinks I have done Brand some mischief. This is not the case, but I was in no position to prove my innocence. I was the last person I know of to see Brand earlier today. Gerard visited his quarters a short time ago. He says the place is broken up. There are blood smears here and there, and Brand is missing. I don't know what to make of it.
Neither do I, but I hope it means that someone has done the job properly this time.
Lord, I said, it's tangled. I wish I had known all these things before.
It was never a proper time to tell you, he said, until now. Certainly not when you were a prisoner and could still be reached, and after that you were gone for a long while. When you returned with your troops and your new weapons, I was uncertain as to your full intentions. Then things happened quickly, and Brand was back again. It was too late. I had to get out to save my skin. I'm strong here in Auden. Here I can take anything you can throw at me. I've been maintaining the patrols at full battle force and awaiting word of Brand's death. I wanted to inquire of one of you whether he was still around, but I could not decide whom to ask, thinking myself still suspect should he have died. As soon as I did get word, though, should it prove he was still living, I was resolved to try at him myself. Now, this state of affairs. What are you going to do now, Corbin?
I'm off to fetch the Jewel of Judgment from a place where I cached it in shadow. There's a way it can be used to destroy the Black Road, and I intend to try it.
How can this be done?
And that is too long a story, for a horrible thought has just occurred to me.
What is that?
Brand wants the jewel. I was asking about it, and now, this power of his to find things in shadow and fetch them back. How good is it? Julian looked thoughtful.
He's hardly omniscient, if this is what you mean. He can find anything you want in shadow the normal way we go about it, by traveling to it. According to Fiona, he just cuts out the footwork. It is therefore an object, not a particular object, that he summons. Besides, that jewel is a very strange item from everything Eric told me about it. I think Brand would have to go after it in person once he finds out where it is.
Then I must get on with my hell ride. I have to beat him to it.
I see you're riding Drum, Julian observed. He's a good beast, a sturdy fellow. Been through many a hell ride.
Glad to hear that, they said. What are you going to do now?
Get in touch with someone in Amber and get up to date on everything we haven't had a chance to talk about. Benedict, probably.
No good, I said. You'll not be able to reach him. He's off to the courts of chaos. Try Gerard and convince him I'm an honorable man while you're about it.
The redheads are the only magicians in this family, but I will try. You did say the courts of chaos?
Yes, but again, the time is too valuable now.
Of course. Get you gone. You will have our leisure later, I trust.
He reached out and clasped my arm. I glanced at the manticora, at the dog seated in a circle about it. Thanks, Julian. You're a difficult man to understand.
Not so. I think the Corbin I hated must have died centuries ago. Ride now, man. If Brand shows up around here, I'll nail his hide to a tree.
He shouted an order to his dogs as I mounted, and they fell upon the carcass of the manticora, lapping at its blood and tearing out huge chunks and strips of flesh. As I rode past that strange, massive, man-like face, I saw that its eyes were still open, though glazed. They were blue, and death had not robbed them of a certain preternatural innocence. Either that, or the look was death's final gift. A senseless way of passing out ironies, as it was. I took Drum back to the trail and began my hell ride. Ugh, my throat's killing me, dude. Alright, we're gonna stop it there. I meant to get back to you guys before the weekend, since I know technically a full week was like Tuesday, but unfortunately I had some custom orders come in at work and that took up some time, but I'm hoping I have custom order that I'm finishing up that's gonna go out on Monday, and then I think Tuesday I'll have a little bit of breathing room after work, so I might see if I can read again, since I only did one chapter this time, and it looks like the next chapter is also pretty short. So we'll see how that works out. I'll try at the very least to be timely with my week deadline. So by next Sunday, for sure, another chapter. Although I'm gonna try to read again. I think Tuesday I'll have enough time, but I'm not gonna promise anything because I'm kind of shit at knowing what my schedule is, and aside from the most vaguest of terms. So anyhow, I'll see you guys next time. And I am feeling a little bit more motivated now to read more. We're finally getting into the part of the book where it's like things are like constantly happening, going from one to the next. And we're getting into the final stretch here. I'd say, honestly, from here all the way to the end of the Courts of Chaos, it is just a ride. And Courts of Chaos is easily my favorite of the series, at least of the Corwin cycle, for sure. Maybe even counting the Merlin cycle as well. I don't know. It's hard to say because I like each cycle for like different reasons. Merlin's cycle is definitely an easier read through because stylistically, it's like a little more modernly written, and there's some fun little like it's a little more playful in tone. And it gets right to the intrigue from the get-go, basically, instead of kind of taking a little while to like build things up and suddenly doing all these big reveals. It's more like it drip feeds you, where like the reveals start out like pretty quick right away, and then you just like build upon them moving forwards. So in that respect, it's a little easier to keep it going. And it's been a while since I've read the Merlin cycle, so it may be easier for me to be motivated to read it. Anyways, I'm definitely looking forward to Courts of Chaos. We still have like another 5 or 6 chapters to go in Hand of Oberon, but Courts of Chaos is, from my memory, Courts of Chaos is kind of a quick one. Which is fine. I like Courts of Chaos a lot because it really has like a really pronounced mystique to it in well, you know, I'm not going to spoil anything, but suffice to say I enjoy it. Anyways, I'll catch up to you guys next time. And hopefully it'll be sooner rather than later, but Sunday at the latest for sure, 100%.